All right, so here we're going to find the midpoint between two values, or between 2 points, and we're simply going to do that just by counting halfway. Remember, the midpoint is the point that's at the middle of the two, all right? The midpoint splits things into two equal pieces, which means if we want to get to the midpoint, we have to count halfway. And sometimes that's really easy to do. Other times, we're going to be counting in a direction or looking for a midpoint in the direction where we can't really count. And so what we'll do is we'll kind of use right triangles to accomplish our counting. All right. So for example, if I look at this first one, I want the distance, or sorry, the midpoint between X and Y. And so if I look at the midpoint of X and Y, I can look at X and Y and just count the distance between the two. I could say, hey, if I just count from X to Y, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 spaces. So if I want to count to the midpoint, well, I simply count halfway. So I count 4 spaces. 1, 2, 3, 4. It's right here. And so I can label that. I can say, the midpoint, I'll call it M, and then I just label the point. That's the ordered pair -4, 1. All right, and so I'm locating the position of the midpoint simply by counting halfway. If I do the same thing for XZ, the problem with XZ, I want to count halfway, but if I look at XZ is from here to here, and so I'm kind of going diagonally. And if you count diagonally across a box, it's not the same as counting the length of that box. The diagonal is actually longer. So I can't really count diagonally. All right, so this is the problem I run into. And so what I have to do is I have to count using essentially a right triangle. And so if you look at this right triangle, count vertically and horizontally to get to Z. In other words, instead of counting directly to Z, I have to kind of count indirectly. I would count to Y first, so I would count down 8 units, because we already counted that earlier. And then I would count over 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 units. And so if you think about that, I counted down 8 and over 6. Well, if I want to get to the midpoint, I count halfway. And so if I counted halfway for the down, I would count down 4. And if I had counted halfway for the over, I'd count over 3. And so watch what happens here. I count down 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and over 3, 1, 2, 3. The midpoint is right here. And we can see that the line that I have drawn wasn't perfect. I missed the actual value in between here. All right, but right there we can see that red mark does look halfway in between the two because it is halfway. Okay, and so because I can't count it directly, I count using a right triangle. And so if I use that right triangle, count how far down, how far over, or how far up, how far over, to find the midpoint, I just count half the distance down, or half the distance up, and half the distance over. Okay, and so for this one, the midpoint this time looks like -1, 1. And that's it. So I count to the midpoint by counting halfway. And yeah, if I have to count in 2 directions, I count halfway in both those directions to get the midpoint. Same thing with these guys. If I want to find the midpoint, I have to count halfway. And so if I look at something like A to B, once again, it's diagonal. So I can't count directly. I have to count indirectly. So for this one, I'm going to count up to get from A to B. I have to go up 2. And then over 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 units. And so if I want the midpoint, I have to go halfway. So instead of going up 2, I go up 1. Instead of going over 9, I go over 4.5. So up 1 over 1, 2, 3, 4.5. It's going to be right here. And so that's the ordered pair, -1.5, comma 4. So the midpoint on this one, -1.5, 4. If I look at C to A, same kind of thing, halfway down, halfway over. So if I count down and over, let's see, that would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 units, 5 units down. I went too far. Then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 units over. And so if I want to count halfway, it's down 2.5, 1, 2.5, over 1, 2.5, which is right here. Okay? And so I end up with the ordered pair -3.5, comma +1/2, so 0.5. Okay? But again, we just look at the distance, we count in the direction that we know how to count, And if we want to find the midpoint, we just count halfway. And if that's in two different directions, it's in two different directions.